Alright, so let's get started with the Module 1 exam review. I'm Dr. Cervantes, of course, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of guidance as we look at preparing for exam number 1, which is coming up in the very near future. Remember, it is a 50-question multiple choice exam, so I'm not going to necessarily be able to give you every single question, but what I wanted to do was give you some idea of what to prepare for. Some of the larger questions that, if you are prepared for these larger questions, will definitely help you when it comes time to actually take the exam. So why don't we go ahead and get started with looking at some of the material in Chapter 1. If you look at Chapter 1, you'll notice that one of the major themes, of course, is the Indians of North and South America. For the purposes of this exam, you really just want to focus on the Indians of North America. Who were the Indians of North America? You'll want to be able to describe the various groupings of North American Indians. Your textbook does a great job of explaining the various cultures of the North American Indians, explaining how things like geography could create a fair amount of diversity among them. So, for example, you have your eastern woodlands Indians, your plains Indians. You have many Indians east of the Mississippi who participate in these mound building cultures. So you want to be able to have a good grasp on these various Indian societies of North America that are present when the Europeans began arriving. Speaking of the Europeans, you definitely want to look at what motivated the Europeans. What exactly drove the Europeans, what pulled the Europeans to the Americas, specifically in this case North America. And when they arrived, what advantage did the Europeans, such as the Spanish, have over those who were already native to North America? One of the things you'll notice in Chapter 1 is something called the Columbian Exchange. You will want to be able to describe the Columbian Exchange, focusing on the advantage one side might have over the other in this exchange of biological organisms, things of that nature. Columbian Exchange, of course, looks at the introduction of new plants, animals, diseases to the New World, to the Americas, and vice versa. The Europeans, of course, were introduced to new plants, animals, diseases that they had no awareness of. So there's definitely a lot of interplay between the two cultures, European culture, Native American culture, on a biological level. It's not just an interchange that happens politically, socially. Very much a biological aspect to this. So you will want to be able to describe that Columbian Exchange in some detail. Moving on to Chapter 2 and Chapter 3, of course, you'll want to start focusing on the 13 English colonies. Of course, it makes sense to look at the 13 English colonies because it is out of those colonies that the United States is born. So why were the various 13 colonies settled? What was it that drove, say, the Massachusetts Bay Company to establish the colony of Massachusetts? What exactly was behind the foundation of Georgia? Why did the Virginia Company want to establish Virginia? Why were the Carolinas put there in the first place? These are the kinds of questions you'll want to think about as you move on to the chapter 2 and chapter 3. Of course, a major aspect of life in the colonies, especially in the southern colonies, is slavery, specifically African slavery. There is a lot of demand for labor, especially in some of the southern colonies where crops like tobacco are being grown. So you do want to be able to describe colonial slavery, looking in particular at the African origins, some of the statistics, for example, how many were brought to the Americas, what was the death rate for those on the ships on their way over from Africa, where specifically would you find more slaves concentrated in the colonies. These are some of the important parts of colonial slavery that you will want to be looking at as you prepare for the exam. Of course, these colonies are not the only European presence in North America. You have the Spanish, you have the French, and you'll notice in your reading that great pains are made to give you some insight into the differences between those different colonies. How did those British colonies differ from, say, the Spanish or the French colonies? How are they different in how they were run and organized, in how they were settled? Those differences are going to give you some insight into how the British are ultimately able to dominate North America over time. Granted, those 13 colonies don't remain British forever, because of course you have the French and Indian War fought in the 1750s and 1760s, and the result of that war is that the French are driven out of North America completely. Great, right? It seems, from the perspective of the British and their 13 colonies. Yay, the French are gone. But it's an expensive war, and the British and the colonies are not going to see eye to eye in how that war should be paid for. So the British are going to take a series of steps that will ultimately drive a wedge between themselves and their colonies in North America, thus creating conditions that will lead to the American Revolution. So then we look at the origins of the American Revolution. And one of the things we're going to see is that Britain attempts to raise money from the colonies in a number of different ways. And they're going to pass a number of laws: the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act. And you'll definitely want to know why Great Britain passed those laws. Were they trying to just be mean? Were they just thinking, hey, let's be jerks to the colonies? Or did they have some larger motives? Last act that you'll want to be very familiar with that the British passed is the coercive acts. The coercive acts passed, as you'll see in your textbook, in response to the Boston Tea Party. So be very familiar with these 4 acts and why the British thought they were necessary. And of course, in all of this, what is the colonial response? How do the colonies receive the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the coercive acts? Do they respond in the same way to all of these acts? Or is there a sense of growing crisis with the passage of each act? And how do the acts maybe create more of a sense of unity among the colonies? Clearly, it seems like there's no going back. By 1775, the tension is at an all-time high between Great Britain and the 13 colonies. And the result, of course, is war, revolution. Now, as we look at the American Revolution, as you read through your textbook, you'll obviously note there's quite a few battles to look at. But for the purposes of the exam, I think it's best if you just look at 3, 4-ish battles in particular. The 2 battles of Lexington and Concord that open up the American Revolution. They're on April 19th, 1775, just outside of Boston, Massachusetts. The Battle of Saratoga, fought in upstate New York in 1777. And then last but not least, Yorktown. For these battles, what you really want to focus on is their significance. With Lexington and Concord, of course, that's where the American Revolution begins. Saratoga is seen by many historians as the turning point of the Revolution, because the result of that battle is that France is persuaded to join the American cause. And then Yorktown, well, Yorktown is important because it turns out to really be the last significant major battle of the American Revolution. So be familiar with those battles and why they are important to the outcome of the war. Last but not least, it's important to look at military leadership in the war. There are a number of generals on both sides, but there are 2 in particular who really play a leading role throughout that war. On the American side, it is of course General George Washington, and on the British side, you're going to have General William Howe. I want you to look at their leadership styles and the struggles that they faced. What did Washington believe was his goal? What did he think he could accomplish with the army that he had? What kind of challenges did the British, specifically General William Howe, have? in trying to put down a revolution 3,000 miles away on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So focus on leadership and the various struggles the two primary military leaders faced in fighting this war. If you're familiar with all of this, you will be in very good shape as you begin to prepare for exam number 1. Good luck, and I hope you all have a nice rest of the semester.